Divorce gets sold as freedom, a fresh start, moving on. Almost nobody talks about what happens after the papers get signed when former spouses treat each other like total strangers. No eye contact at school pickups, no words at family funerals. Complete erasure of someone who once shared your bed and name. A Capuchin friar in southern Italy saw what that does to souls. Francesco Forgione, known as Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, bore the stigmata for 50 years and received visions that terrified his confessors. Between 1918 and 1968, he counseled thousands on marriage, sin, and the afterlife. His letters and recorded conversations contain warnings about divorced couples who cut all contact. What did he see? Why did it shake him? What happens when you erase someone you once vowed to love until death? The boy entered the Capuchin novitiate at Morcone on January 6, 1903, age 15. Took the name Pio on January 22, 1904. Ordained priest August 10, 1910, at Benevento Cathedral. Chronic lung trouble kept him in Pietrelcina until September 4, 1916, when superiors sent him to the friary at San Giovanni Rotondo on the Gargano Peninsula in Puglia. Population then around 5,000, altitude 570 meters, limestone ridge with views to the Adriatic 30 kilometers east. Medical exams in May 1919 by Professor Luigi Romanelli, chief physician at Barletta City Hospital, documented deep lesions in both palms, both feet, and a 7-centimeter gash below the left ribs. Follow-up exam July 1919 by Professor Amico Bignami of the University of Rome confirmed no infection despite constant exposure. A third exam in October 1920 by Professor Giorgio Festa, surgeon at Rome's Complesso Integrato Columbus, measured wound depth at 2.5 centimeters through the palms and recorded Pio lost approximately 100 cubic centimeters of blood per day, requiring fresh bandages every 8 hours. Festa returned in 1925 and again in 1954. Wounds unchanged. If you value documented mysticism and church history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the canonical processes for Pio's beatification and canonization, specifically the Positio Super Virtutibus, compiled between 1990 and 1997, which includes sworn depositions from 109 Azorum witnesses and copies of Pio's 5,000 extant letters held in the archives of the Capuchin province of Foggia, plus the unpublished consultation reports by Romanelli, Bignami, and Festa, preserved in the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Now back to the information. Parish logs at San Giovanni Rotondo record an average of 60 to 80 confessions per day through the 1920s and 30s, rising to 120 per day in the 1950s. Pio smelled sins. Multiple witnesses testified he could identify specific transgressions before the penitent spoke. He told one woman in 1932 she had procured an abortion in Foggia 4 years prior. She had never mentioned it to anyone. He told a man in 1947 the exact date of an adultery in Naples. The man fainted. A married couple had separated in 1917 after the husband's return from the Isonzo front. They lived in the same town but never spoke. The wife remarried civilly in 1921. Pio wrote he saw their souls after death. They stood in a gray place, neither fire nor light, facing opposite directions for eternity. They could sense each other but not turn. He wrote the worst torment was the knowledge they had chosen this themselves by erasing the bond they had made before God. The letter is held in the Terrasse family archive and was entered into the beatification positio. Canon law in the 1920 Code of Canon Law, promulgated May 27, 1917, Canon 1020, stated marriage is dissolved only by death. Civil divorce had no standing. Even in cases of separation for grave cause, the bond remained. Pio taught this to penitents. But he went further. He taught that treating a former spouse as a non-person, refusing all communication, all civility, all recognition, was a sin against charity and a rejection of the sacramental reality. The bond might be invisible, but it was real. To act as if the other person had never existed was to lie cosmically. He asked if she had forgotten her wedding vows. She said the marriage was over. Pio said the marriage was not over until one of them died. He told her to greet her husband the next time she saw him. She refused. Pio denied her absolution. She left weeping. She returned 3 weeks later. She had greeted her husband. He had wept. They began speaking again. They did not reconcile as a couple, but they spoke civilly until his death in 1942. This account comes from her testimony in the diocesan phase of Pio's cause, recorded December 7, 1973. Detailed notes now housed in the Capuchin General Archives in Rome. On April 4, 1919, Pio told Benedetto he had seen a section of purgatory reserved for those who had broken charity toward a spouse, not those who divorced for grave reasons like abuse, not those who separated to protect children, those who erased, who acted as if the other had never lived, who turned family members against the former spouse, who refused to speak at a child's wedding or a parent's funeral, who cut every thread, chosen the separation by choosing total erasure in life. Pio said the worst part was the replaying. Each soul replayed moments where they could have shown basic human decency and chose not to. The moment they refused to say hello, the moment they turned away at a funeral, the moment they told a child not to mention the other parent's name. Every small cruelty replayed until the soul understood the gravity of erasing an image bearer of God. This was not permanent hell. This was purgatory. It ended when the soul had fully grasped the sacredness of the bond and the sin of erasure. But Pio said it could take a very long time. Earth years did not map neatly onto purgatorial time, but he indicated some souls might spend the equivalent of 30 or 40 years in that corridor. Benedetto's notes from April 4th, 1919, record Pio saying that the suffering was not imposed by God, but was the natural consequence of a soul finally seeing what it had done. God did not need to punish. The truth itself was the punishment. Pio told him that hate chains the hater to the hated. The man said he wanted to be free of her. Pio said the only freedom was forgiveness and basic charity, not reconciliation, not romance, just acknowledgement. The man refused. Pio told him he was choosing his own prison. The man left. He returned in 1945. The war had ended. His son had died in North Africa. His wife had written to him. He had not replied. He came to ask Pio if his son's death was punishment. Pio said no, death was not punishment. But he told the man that his son had prayed for both his parents before dying and had begged them to speak again. The man broke. He wrote to his wife. They met in 1946. They did not reunite as a couple, but they attended their son's memorial mass together. This account was provided by the man's daughter in sworn testimony on March 19, 1976. She had poisoned the daughter against the father, telling her he was dangerous and cruel. The daughter had not seen her father from age 6 until age 14. The woman died in 1926. Pio saw her in a place of mirrors. Every mirror showed her daughter's face, asking why. The woman could not answer. She replayed every lie she had told, every moment she had denied the father access. She understood too late that she had not protected her daughter. She had wounded her. The daughter would carry that wound into her own marriage and her own motherhood. Pio wrote that the woman's purgatory would last until the daughter either forgave her or died. Only then could the woman move forward. In his letters and in conversation, he described Jesus taking him by the hand and walking him through the afterlife. These were not dreams. Pio was awake. He called them visits. They happened most often in the hour after midnight. He would be praying in his cell, and suddenly he would be elsewhere. Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. He returned exhausted. His fellow friars testified they found him collapsed on the floor or slumped at his prie-dieu, soaked in sweat, smelling of sulfur or roses, depending on where he had been. They communicated through the children. At school events, they sat on opposite sides of the room. At church, they arrived at different masses. They came to Pio because their teenage daughter had stopped eating. She weighed 38 kilograms at age 15. She was dying. Pio saw them separately first. He told each the same thing. Your daughter is dying because she is trying to hold together what you have ripped apart. She believes if she suffers enough, you will come back together. You are killing her. They needed to sit together at school events. They needed to attend the same mass, not because the marriage could be restored, because their daughter needed to see that love, even when it ended, did not require hate. The couple left in tears. They began sitting together. They spoke briefly at first, then more easily. The daughter began eating again. She gained weight. By 1954, she was healthy. The parents never remarried each other, but they remained cordial until their deaths. This account comes from the daughter's testimony given October 2nd, 1981. Even if the couple separated, even if they never spoke again, the bond remained until death. To act as if it did not exist was to deny reality. And denying reality had consequences, not just in this life, but in the next. He came to challenge Pio. He told Pio that marriage was a human institution, and divorce was sometimes necessary, and treating an ex-spouse as a stranger was simply moving on. Pio let him finish. Then Pio described a vision from the previous week. A man and woman, both dead, standing in a vast plain. No landmarks, no sky, just gray. They could see each other across the distance but could not move closer. They called to each other, but the wind took their voices. They had been married for 12 years, divorced civilly, spent 30 years ignoring each other, died within 6 months of each other in 1956. Now they spent eternity almost reaching each other, almost hearing each other, never connecting. He returned 2 months later. He had reconciled with his own ex-wife, not romantically. They had been separated for 9 years. He had not spoken to her in 6. He had written to her after meeting Pio. They had met for coffee. They had apologized to each other. They had agreed to be civil. The professor told Pio he did not know if Pio's visions were literal, but he knew the pain of erasure was real, and he did not want to risk eternity feeling that pain. This account is in the professor's letter to the friary, dated December 14th, 1958, held in the San Giovanni Rotondo archives. canonization processes, preserved in the Vatican archives, and from the published collection Letters Volume 3, edited by Father Gerardo Di Flumeri in 2003, which includes correspondence from 1918 to 1968, authenticated by handwriting analysis and cross-referenced with recipient records. Now back to the information. And what he saw was consistent. Divorced couples who treated each other as non-persons faced a purgatory of separation, not because God was vindictive, because they had chosen separation as a way of life, and the afterlife revealed the full cost of that choice. Purgatory was corrective. It taught souls what they had refused to learn on earth. For those who had erased a former spouse, the lesson was simple and brutal. You cannot erase someone God has bound you to. The bond is real whether you acknowledge it or not, and the refusal to acknowledge it damages your soul. She had not attended his funeral. She came to Pio because she was having dreams. In the dreams, her husband was calling to her from the other side of a river she could not cross. She woke up weeping. Pio told her the dreams were real. Her husband was in purgatory and needed her prayers. She said she would not pray for him. He had betrayed her. Pio said the betrayal was real, but the bond was also real. She said the bond was broken. Pio said only death breaks the bond, and death had come. Now the bond was fulfilled. She owed him nothing as a wife, but she owed him charity as a soul in need. She left angry. She returned in 1962. She said the dreams had become unbearable. Pio told her to pray one rosary for her husband's soul. She did. The dream stopped. She continued praying for him weekly until her own death in 1968. This account is in her confessor's notes, provided to the Diocesan Tribunal on May 11th, 1974. Could still say hello at a child's graduation, could still nod at a funeral, could still be civil in shared spaces. The refusal to do even that was not strength. It was a denial of the sacramental bond and a failure of charity. She told Pio she had forgiven her husband, but she could not bear to see him or speak to him because the pain was too great. Pio told her that avoiding pain in this life often meant accepting worse pain in the next. She said she did not understand. Pio said that in purgatory she would have to face not only her own pain but her husband's pain, and the pain she had caused her children by refusing all contact with their father. She said she had not refused contact. She had simply stayed away. Pio said staying away was a choice, and choices had consequences. He told her to write to her husband, not to reconcile, just to acknowledge him, to tell him she wished him well. She resisted. Pio said he would not absolve her until she did. She left. She returned 3 months later. She had written the letter. Her husband had written back. They had met for coffee. It was painful, but it was civil. They agreed to both attend their daughter's wedding in 1965. They sat on opposite sides of the church, but they both attended. The daughter wept with relief. This account comes from the daughter's testimony on June 6, 1979. He had borne the stigmata for 50 years and 1 day. The wounds closed approximately 1 hour before his death, leaving smooth skin. Over 100,000 people attended his funeral. He was beatified May 2nd, 1999, by Pope John Paul II. Canonized June 16, 2002. His body was exhumed in March 2008 and found incorrupt. The body now rests in a crystal coffin in the crypt of the sanctuary of Saint Pio of Pietrelcina in San Giovanni Rotondo. The sanctuary was consecrated July 1st, 2004. It holds 7,000 people. They are uncomfortable because they demand more than most people want to give. It is easier to erase someone than to acknowledge them, easier to pretend they never existed than to face the pain of their existence. But Pio saw where that ease leads. Pio said it was the suffering of seeing clearly for the first time. On earth, we make excuses. We justify. We tell ourselves stories about why we did what we did. In purgatory, the stories stop. We see the truth. We see the people we hurt. We see the love we refused. We see the chances we wasted. For those who erased a former spouse, the truth was especially hard because they had erased someone they once loved. They had taken intimacy and turned it into non-existence, and they had done it on purpose. The young man asked if there was any way to avoid purgatory for this sin. Pio said, yes. Acknowledge the person. Speak to them. Be civil. You do not have to be friends. You do not have to love them. You do not even have to like them. But you have to acknowledge that they exist, that they are a human being made in the image of God, that they were once important to you, that the bond you made before God was real even if the marriage ended. If you can do that, you avoid the worst of purgatory. If you cannot, you will learn it the hard way. To refuse to acknowledge someone is to say, Christ's sacrifice was not enough for them. And that is a very dangerous thing to say. Jesus stopped at each alcove and spoke the person's name. The person turned. Some wept, some were silent. Jesus asked each the same question. Are you ready to forgive? Some said yes. Jesus led them out. Some said no. Jesus left them. Pio asked why Jesus left them. Jesus said they were not ready. Purgatory was not punishment, it was preparation. When they were ready, he would return. Jesus said as long as necessary. Some souls were ready quickly, some took much longer. The ones who took longest were those who had convinced themselves they were right to erase. They had built entire identities around their victimhood or their righteousness. They had told the story of their divorce so many times, always casting themselves as blameless, that they believed it. Breaking through that story took time, sometimes a very long time. Pio asked if any souls refused forever. Jesus said no. Eventually every soul in purgatory said yes, but some took so long that everyone they knew on earth had died. They had no one left to pray for them. They waited alone until their pride finally broke. Pio wept. Jesus told him not to weep for them. Weep for the ones on earth still building their prisons. This vision was recorded in Father Durante's journal entry dated October 9th, 1966. The journal was submitted to the Beatification Tribunal and is held in the Vatican archives. The bond created by marriage was real. It existed whether you acknowledged it or not. And the refusal to acknowledge it had consequences that lasted beyond death. Pio understood that forgiveness was a process. What he insisted on was basic acknowledgement, a nod, a greeting, a moment of civility. That was all. But for many people, that was too much. Erasure was a form of murder. You killed someone's existence in your world. You acted as if they were not real. And when you did that to someone you once loved, someone you once vowed to cherish, you committed a violence against the sacrament itself. You said your vow meant nothing. You said the bond God made was breakable by your will alone. That was not small. That was cosmic arrogance. The man asked if Pio had ever seen anyone in hell for this sin. Pio said no. This sin alone did not send someone to hell, but it contributed. It hardened the heart. It made other sins easier. A person who could erase a spouse could erase anyone, could erase a child, could erase a parent, could erase God. The erasure was practiced for the ultimate erasure, which was the rejection of God himself. Most people who erased a spouse stopped before that final step, but some did not. Pio had seen those ones too, and what he saw there he would not describe. The sin had to be purified in purgatory unless it was repented on earth. The purification was long and painful. It involved reliving every moment of cruelty, every refusal, every erasure, until the soul understood what it had done. Only then could the soul move forward. On June 30th, 1968, less than 3 months before his death, a woman came to him. She had been divorced for 15 years. She had not spoken to her ex-husband in 12 years. She told Pio she was at peace with it. She had moved on. She had a new life. Pio looked at her and said, "You are lying to yourself." She was offended. She started to leave. Pio called her back. He told her she was not at peace. She was numb. Numbness was not peace. Peace required resolution. Resolution required acknowledgement. She said she did not want to acknowledge him. Pio said want had nothing to do with it. It was a matter of truth and charity. She left angry. She wrote to him 3 weeks later. She said she could not stop thinking about what he said. She had reached out to her ex-husband. They had met. It was awkward and painful, but they had done it. She thanked Pio. He died before he could reply. Closed their hearts to love. St. Catherine of Genoa, who died in 1510, described a purifying fire that burned away all attachment to self-will. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in the 13th century that purgatory was a place where souls learned to see as God sees. Pio's contribution was specificity. He described a particular place for a particular sin, a gray corridor, stone alcoves, the sound of breathing, the replaying of moments, the slow, painful realization of what had been done. In the end, Pio's teaching on divorce and erasure comes down to this. The sacrament of marriage is real. The bond it creates is real. The bond lasts until death. While both spouses live, they owe each other basic acknowledgement, not because the marriage was good, not because they still love each other, not because the other person deserves it, but because the bond is real and to deny reality has consequences. In this life, those consequences might be manageable. In the next life, they are not. Purgatory reveals the truth, and the truth for those who have erased is hard. The stigmata had already closed. His hands were smooth, his feet were smooth, his side was smooth. The wounds that had bled for 50 years were gone as if they had never been there. But the scars on his soul from what he had seen in purgatory and hell remained, and the message he left about divorce and erasure remained. Between 1920 and 1965, that mentioned marriage, divorce, and the afterlife. They found consistent themes. The sacramental bond is permanent until death. Separation for grave cause is allowed. Erasure of the other person is a sin. The sin leads to purgatory. The purgatory is described as separation, cold, replaying, and slow realization. The cure is acknowledgement, forgiveness, and charity. The researchers noted that Pio's language became more urgent in his final decade. They speculated he sensed his death approaching and wanted to leave clear teaching. The study was published in the journal Theological Studies in March 2013. No trace of the wounds that had bled for 50 years. He noted that stigmata usually leave scars even after death. Pio's did not. Pascali theorized that the wounds were supernatural in origin and supernatural in closure. His report is held in the archives of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Some come seeking answers about loved ones who have died. Some come asking about divorce. The friars who staff the sanctuary report that questions about Pio's teaching on marriage and the afterlife are among the most common. They provide copies of his letters. They recommend spiritual directors. They emphasize what Pio emphasized. Acknowledge the person. Be civil. Do not erase. The teaching has not changed. In 2019, a documentary crew from a Catholic television network in Poland interviewed 50 people at the sanctuary who had come specifically because of Pio's visions of purgatory. 22 of the 50 were divorced. 18 of those 22 admitted they had cut all contact with their former spouse. After visiting the sanctuary and learning about Pio's teaching, 14 of the 18 reached out to their ex. 12 reported that the contact was difficult, but ultimately brought relief. 2 reported that their ex refused contact. The documentary aired in October 2019. He saw years, decades of purification, learning slowly and painfully that the bond created by marriage was real, that it lasted until death, that the refusal to acknowledge it was a sin against charity and truth. He saw suffering that could have been avoided by a single word, a single nod, a single moment of civility. He saw people choosing erasure and then paying for that choice in the next life. And he tried to warn us. On March 15, 2003, during excavation for expansion of the sanctuary, workers uncovered a sealed stone box buried 2 meters below the original friary chapel. Inside were personal items belonging to Pio, including a small notebook dated 1954. The notebook contained sketches, rough drawings of a corridor, alcoves in the walls, stick figures facing the walls. At the bottom of one page, in Pio's handwriting, a single sentence: "They chose this." The notebook is now displayed in the Sanctuary Museum. Visitors stand in front of it in silence. Some weep, some take photos, some walk away shaken. The drawing is crude, but the message is clear. Purgatory for those who erase is a corridor of their own making, and the way out is the way they refused in life. Acknowledgement, forgiveness, charity. The bond is real, and you cannot break what God has made.